Eddie Van Halen woke up on March 3, 2007, reached for his guitar like he had every morning for 50 years, and realized with absolute horror that his fingers wouldn't move. Not wouldn't obey. Couldn't move. The chemotherapy had destroyed the nerves in his hands, the same hands that had revolutionized guitar playing, the same fingers that had created sounds no one had ever heard before. Gone. Eddie stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. Then he looked at his guitar, his Frankenstrat, the instrument he'd built with his own hands, and felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with cancer. Because Eddie Van Halen could survive losing his tongue. He could survive losing his voice, but losing his ability to play guitar, that was losing himself. The surgery had happened 6 weeks earlier, in January 2007. The cancer had returned, aggressive and merciless. Doctors at Cedars-Sinai had to remove 1/3 of Eddie's tongue. The recovery was brutal, but Eddie had done it before. He knew the drill. Pain, medication, liquid diet, slow healing. He could handle that. What he didn't know was that the chemotherapy that followed would steal something even more precious than his voice. It would steal his hands. The first sign came during his second week of chemotherapy. Eddie was sitting in the treatment chair, poison dripping into his veins, Wolfgang beside him as always. Eddie's son was 16 now, tall and strong, trying so hard to be brave for his father. Eddie looked down at his hands resting on the armrests and realized he couldn't feel them. "Wolfie," Eddie said, his voice raspy from the surgery, "touch my hand." Wolfgang reached over and squeezed his father's hand. Eddie felt pressure, but it was distant, muted, like feeling something through thick winter gloves. "Can you feel that?" Wolfgang asked. "Barely," Eddie admitted, staring at their joined hands. "I can feel pressure, but not your hand. Not really." The oncologist explained it that afternoon. "It's called peripheral neuropathy, common side effect of chemotherapy. The nerves in your extremities, particularly hands and feet, can be damaged. For most patients, sensation returns after treatment ends. For some, it's permanent." Eddie nodded, absorbing this information. "And if it's permanent, what then?" The doctor hesitated. "Then you adapt, learn to live with it." Eddie didn't say what he was thinking. "I'm a guitar player. Adaptation isn't an option. Feel is everything. Without feeling in his fingers, he might as well be paralyzed." But Eddie pushed that fear down. He'd beaten cancer before. He'd beat this too. The feeling would come back. It had to come back. The chemotherapy continued for 6 weeks. With each treatment, the numbness grew worse. By week 4, Eddie couldn't feel anything below his wrists. His hands were like dead weight at the ends of his arms. He could move them, could control the gross motor functions, but the fine motor control was gone. He couldn't feel texture, couldn't feel temperature, couldn't feel the subtle feedback that every musician relies on. He tried to hide it from everyone, especially Wolfgang. His son was already carrying so much worry. Eddie didn't want to add to it. So he practiced moving his fingers, doing hand exercises the physical therapist recommended, pretending everything was fine. But inside, Eddie was terrified. March 3, 2007. 6 weeks post-chemotherapy. The doctor said this was when sensation should start returning if it was going to return at all. Eddie woke up that morning with hope, real hope. Today would be the day. The nerves would wake up. He'd feel his fingers again. He sat up in bed and looked at his hands. Opened and closed them, wiggled his fingers. Everything moved, but he felt nothing. No pins and needles that would signal nerve regeneration. No tingling. Nothing. Eddie's Frankenstrat was leaning against the wall where it always was. He'd been avoiding it for weeks, telling himself he was just waiting to heal. But the truth was, he'd been too scared to try. Too scared to confirm what he already suspected. But this morning, he had to know. Eddie picked up the guitar. The weight felt wrong in his hands. He couldn't feel the familiar contours, the smooth wood, the cool metal of the strings. He positioned the guitar on his lap the way he had thousands of times before. Muscle memory guided his left hand to the neck, his right hand over the strings. Eddie took a breath and tried to play the opening lick of Eruption. 4 simple notes that he'd played in his sleep. His fingers pressed down on the fretboard. At least, he thought they did. He couldn't actually feel if he was pressing hard enough. He strummed with his right hand. The sound that came out was awful, Dead notes, buzzing strings. His fingers weren't pressing hard enough, or they were in the wrong position, or both. Eddie tried again. Same result. He tried slower, concentrating on every movement. Still wrong. For 15 minutes, Eddie tried to play those four notes that had once been as natural as breathing. And he couldn't do it. The disconnect between his brain and his fingers was complete. He knew exactly what to do, but his hands couldn't execute it. Finally, Eddie set the guitar down carefully, walked to the bathroom, closed the door, and for the first time since his cancer diagnosis, allowed himself to completely break down. He slid down the wall to the floor and sobbed. Great, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He was Eddie Van Halen, one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. People had spent decades trying to copy his technique. He'd invented sounds, he'd revolutionized rock music, and now he couldn't play four notes. Wolfgang found him there 20 minutes later. Eddie tried to compose himself, tried to wipe his face, tried to pretend he was fine. "Dad?" Wolfgang's voice was gentle. "I heard you trying to play." Eddie couldn't look at his son. "It's gone, Wolfie. I can't feel my hands. I can't play." Wolfgang sat down on the bathroom floor next to his father. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Do the doctors think it'll come back?" Wolfgang finally asked. "They don't know. Maybe. Maybe not." Eddie's voice was hollow. "Wolfie, without guitar, who am I? What am I supposed to do? This is all I've ever known. Since I was 7 years old, I've been a guitar player. That's my identity. That's my purpose. Without it, I'm just nothing." "You're my dad," Wolfgang said firmly. "That's who you are. Guitar player or not, you're still my dad." Eddie finally looked at his son. Wolfgang's eyes were wet with tears, but his jaw was set with determination. "You taught me something when I was 9, Wolfgang continued. "Remember? When you got diagnosed the first time and I said you weren't allowed to die, you told me that Van Halens don't quit. We fight, no matter what, even when it seems impossible." Eddie remembered. Of course he remembered. "This is your fight now, Dad," Wolfgang said. "Not cancer. This, getting your hands back. And I'm going to help you, just like you helped me with everything. We're going to figure this out together." That conversation changed something in Eddie. Not overnight, but slowly. Wolfgang's words planted a seed of determination that started to grow. The next day, Eddie called his physical therapist and requested an intensive program. If the nerves were damaged, maybe they could be retrained. Maybe muscle memory could compensate for the loss of sensation. Maybe. For the next 3 months, Eddie worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life. Harder than touring, harder than recording. He did nerve stimulation exercises, hand strengthening, coordination drills. He spent hours trying to play scales without looking at his hands, trying to teach his fingers to know where they were through position sense alone rather than touch. Wolfgang practiced with him every day. They started with the simplest exercises, open chords, single notes, building up slowly. Eddie would play a note and Wolfgang would tell him if it was clean or if it was buzzing. Eddie couldn't feel the difference, but Wolfgang became his feedback system. Progress was agonizingly slow. Some days, Eddie felt like he was getting worse instead of better. He'd have a good day where he could play a simple chord progression, then the next day he couldn't manage even that. The frustration was overwhelming. One particularly bad day in May, Eddie threw his guitar across the room. Wolfgang didn't say anything. He just picked it up, checked it for damage, and handed it back to his father. "Again," Wolfgang said simply. "What's the point?" Eddie asked, defeated. "It's been 3 months, Wolfie. I'm not getting better." "Yes, you are," Wolfgang insisted. 3 months ago, you couldn't play a single note. Last week, you played through an entire verse of Jump. It was rough, but you played it. That's progress." "It's not good enough," Eddie said bitterly. "Not yet," Wolfgang agreed, "but it will be. You taught me that guitar takes patience, that nobody starts out great, even you. You told me you practiced Eruption thousands of times before you recorded it. This is no different. You're learning to play again, and you'll do it, because you're Eddie Van Halen." Those words hit Eddie hard. His 16-year-old son was teaching him his own lessons back to him. And Wolfgang was right. Eddie had spent 50 years practicing guitar. Why would relearning be any different? That night, Eddie looked at his hands for a long time. They still felt dead. still felt disconnected. But they were his hands. They'd created so much music. They'd held his son when he was born. They'd built guitars. They'd expressed everything Eddie had ever felt, and they would play again. He decided it. Right there. Not hoped it, not wished it. Decided it. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would play again. The breakthrough came on June 15, 2007. Eddie was practicing in his studio, working through a simple scale exercise for what felt like the millionth time. Wolfgang was at school. Eddie was alone with his guitar and his frustration. He was playing through the E minor pentatonic scale when something strange happened. For just a second, for just one note, he felt something. Not a full sensation, more like a ghost of feeling, a whisper of connection. Eddie stopped, took a breath, tried the note again. There it was again. The faintest sensation, like his finger was waking up from being asleep. His heart started racing. Eddie tried different notes on the same finger. There and there. Not every note, not consistent, but something. After 4 months of complete numbness, something was coming back. Eddie played for 4 hours straight that afternoon, cataloging every tiny sensation, every hint of returning nerve function. It wasn't much, it wasn't even close to normal. But it was hope. Real, tangible hope. When Wolfgang came home from school, Eddie was still playing. Wolfgang stood in the doorway of the studio, watching his father. "Wolfie," Eddie said without stopping, "I can feel it. Not much. Maybe 10% of what it should be, but I can feel something." Wolfgang's face lit up. "Yeah? Yeah." Eddie finally stopped playing and looked at his son. "You were right. It just took time. The nerves are healing. They're slow, but they're healing." Over the next 6 months, the sensation gradually returned. Not all of it. Eddie would never have full feeling in his hands again. The peripheral neuropathy left permanent damage. Some areas of his fingers remained partially numb for the rest of his life. But it was enough. It was more than enough. Eddie learned to compensate. He developed new techniques that didn't rely as heavily on subtle touch. He adjusted his playing style. He found ways to make his reduced sensation work for him rather than against him. By the end of 2007, Eddie Van Halen could play again. Not exactly like he had before. His playing was different now. Some of the blazing speed was gone. Some of the delicate nuance was harder to achieve. But the musicality was still there. The creativity was still there. The soul was still there. And in some ways, his playing became even more powerful. Because now it carried the weight of everything he'd almost lost. Every note meant something. Every song was a gift. Every performance was a celebration of the miracle that he could still do this at all. Van Halen went back into the studio in 2008. They worked on new material. Eddie approached it differently than he had in the past. He was more patient, more thoughtful. He spent less time showing off technique and more time serving the song. Wolfgang, now playing bass in the band, watched his father work with new appreciation. He'd seen Eddie at his lowest point. He'd watched him fight his way back. And now he got to make music with him. During a break in recording, Wolfgang asked, "Dad, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't gotten the feeling back? Even partially?" Eddie was quiet for a moment, adjusting the tuning on his guitar by touch and hearing rather than by feel alone. "Yeah," he admitted. "I think about it. And you know what? I think I would have found a way. Maybe not the same way. Maybe not as well. But I would have found a way to make music. Because that's what we do, Wolfie. We adapt. We survive. We create." He looked at his son. "You taught me that, when I wanted to give up. When I threw that guitar. You picked it up and handed it back and said, 'Again.' You reminded me that this is who I am, not just what I do, who I am." Years later, in interviews, Eddie would sometimes be asked about his guitar technique, about his speed, about his famous tapping method, and sometimes he'd tell them about 2007, about the morning he woke up and couldn't feel his hands, about the 3 months when he thought his career was over, about his 16-year-old son becoming his teacher. "People think technique is about speed or precision," Eddie would say, "but real technique is about adaptation. It's about finding a way when the old way doesn't work anymore. I lost feeling in my hands. I had to relearn everything. And you know what? It made me a better musician because I couldn't rely on muscle memory alone anymore. I had to really think about every note, really mean it. Music became more intentional, more conscious, more alive. Wolfgang would add in his own interviews, "My dad taught me that being a musician isn't about perfect conditions. It's about making music anyway." He could have quit. He had every reason to quit. But he didn't. Because music wasn't just what he did. It was how he breathed, how he thought, how he loved. Taking away his sensation didn't take away his music. It just changed how he had to express it. March 3rd, 2007. The morning Eddie Van Halen woke up and couldn't feel his fingers. The morning he thought everything was over. The morning that could have been the end. But it wasn't the end. It was a transformation, a death and rebirth. The old Eddie Van Halen, who relied on virtuosity and speed, died that morning. And a new Eddie Van Halen, who played with intentionality and hard-won wisdom, was born. The guitar in the corner of his room never sat silent for long. And when it spoke with the voice of someone who knew what it meant to lose everything and fight to get it back. Someone who understood that mastery isn't about never falling, it's about getting back up. Again, and again, and again. Eddie Van Halen's hands would never be the same. But they were still his hands. And they still made music. And sometimes, that's all the miracle you need.